Imagine a world carved from stone and shadow, where knights moved with solemn purpose beneath the towering spires of medieval cathedrals, their white mantles embroidered with black crosses gleaming in the flickering torchlight. This was the world of the Teutonic Order, a mysterious brotherhood whose story stretches across centuries of conquest, devotion, and transformation. Sit back, relax, and allow yourself to drift into a time when Europe was a patchwork of warring fiefdoms, fragile kingdoms, and uncharted forests, where the line between legend and reality blurred beneath the steel and faith of men bound by oaths older than many nations. Founded during the chaos of the Third Crusade, the Teutonic Knights were at once warriors and monks, blending the discipline of monastic life with the deadly precision of military campaigns. Some historians suggest their arrival in the Holy Land was a strategic move. Others whisper of divine visions and a calling that reached beyond earthly power. Their initial mission was simple yet monumental: care for sick and injured, pilgrims in the Holy Land. Yet beneath this humble purpose, ambitions grew, territories were carved, and influence spread like a shadow creeping over the medieval landscape. Picture the cold stone halls of their first fortresses, the sharp scent of pine torches mingling with the metallic temps of armor, the echo of armored footsteps along narrow corridors. From these beginnings arose an order that would become both feared and respected, leaving imprints on the Baltic coasts, Prussian lands, and the heart of European politics. And yet, for all their power, there was an undercurrent of fragility, a tension between devotion and ambition, between the vow of poverty and the allure of wealth and territory. As we embark on this journey through centuries, you will witness the rise of a force that reshaped landscapes, toppled kingdoms, and survived revolutions, wars, and the relentless passage of time. But how did these knights, once bound to the sacred soil of Jerusalem and the icy forests of Prussia, endure the seismic shifts of European history? That question lingers in the shadows of their castles, waiting to be unraveled as we move to the next chapter of their enigmatic tale. From the sun-scorched sands of the Holy Land, the Teutonic Knights story drifts northward into the dense, mist-laden forests of the Baltic region, where unknown rivers twist through endless expanses of pine and fir, and the wind whispers secrets through shadowed groves. It was here, in the lands of Prussia and Livonia, that the order found both opportunity and purpose beyond caring for pilgrims, a chance to carve anew dominion from untamed wilderness. Imagine the landscape stretching for miles, marshes and bogs glistening under a grey sky, the cries of distant wolves mingling with the sound of axes and hammer strikes as fortresses rose from the earth. Some historians argue the knights were driven by the purest intentions of spreading Christianity to the pagan tribes of the north, while others suggest ambition and the promise of territorial power played equal roles in shaping their campaigns. They moved with meticulous organization, a brotherhood whose life was bound by both spiritual devotion and martial precision. Their castles were more than fortresses. They were symbols of authority, bastions of influence, and hubs for administration. Within these walls, illuminated manuscripts captured the order's codes, treaties, and chronicles, while the clatter of armor in training yards reminded all who approached that these monks were also warriors. The Teutonic Order established a rigid hierarchy with Grand Masters at the apex, wielding authority not just over their brothers but over entire regions, collecting taxes, directing trade, and enforcing laws in a manner that mirrored secular kings. Yet, beyond the grandeur of power and ceremony, the brothers remained monks at heart, bound by vows of chastity, obedience, and piety, their daily lives punctuated by prayer, reflection, and ritual. The tension between their spiritual calling and military obligations created a rhythm both disciplined and haunting, a rhythm that resonated through the forests, rivers, and stone halls of their northern strongholds. Over decades, the order expanded relentlessly, absorbing villages, founding towns, and asserting dominance over lands that were once untamed. And yet, for all their conquest, shadows lingered at the edges of their realm, rival lords, rebellious tribes, and the ever-present tension with neighboring kingdoms reminded the Teutonic Knights that power was fragile, even for those who wielded it with divine sanction. As the centuries stretched on, these knights became architects not just of stone, but of history itself, a force both revered and feared, whose legacy would be tested by revolutions, empires, and the sweeping tides of change. And it is in this delicate balance between devotion, ambition, and survival that we find the seeds of mysteries that will follow them into centuries yet to come, waiting for us to uncover them in the chapters ahead. As the 15th century dawned, the Teutonic Order faced challenges that would test not only their military might, but the very foundation of their authority. As the winds of political and social change began to sweep through Europe, unseen yet unstoppable, the once remote forests and marshes of Prussia became the stage for confrontations that would shape the fate of the Knights, their campaigns clashing with the rising power of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a formidable alliance that sought to curb the Order's relentless expansion. Imagine the tension in the air before battle, the heavy mist curling over frozen rivers, the cold biting through steel and chainmail, the muffled sound of hooves on frost-hardened earth, and the faint clinking of swords against shields, a symphony of impending conflict that heralded the twilight of the Order's dominance in the region. Some scholars suggest that the Knights' rigid hierarchical structure, once a source of unshakable strength, now slowed their response to the fluid and unconventional strategies of their opponents, leaving them vulnerable despite their legendary discipline. Others propose that internal strife, the pressures of sustaining distant territories, and the challenge of governing an increasingly complex society contributed as much to their difficulties as external enemies. The Battle of Grunwald in 1410 became the focal point of this struggle, a confrontation where the Order's seemingly invincible reputation was violently tested. Thousands of armored knights, their surcoats emblazoned with black crosses, faced a coalition determined to halt their expansion. The clash of swords, the roar of cavalry, and the chaos of combat etched themselves into the annals of history as a turning point from which the Teutonic Order would never fully recover. Yet, even in defeat, the Knights were not obliterated. Their identity, rituals, and organizational structure survived, retreating into a more defensive posture, consolidating their remaining territories, and redefining their purpose. This moment of vulnerability also sparked adaptation, as the Order gradually shifted focus from conquest to governance, diplomacy, and maintaining the spiritual cohesion of their brotherhood. And it is in this careful recalibration of identity where power, piety, and survival intertwined that we glimpse the enduring resilience of the Teutonic Order, a resilience that would carry them across centuries of upheaval, revolutions, and exile, waiting to be tested by forces far greater than swords and siege engines. As we leave the battlefields behind and move toward the quiet halls of administration, we begin to see a different kind of strength emerge, one built on faith, strategy, and the determination to endure against the relentless march of history, setting the stage for a story that continues to unfold in the shadows of Europe's grand transformations. With the echoes of battle fading into memory, the Teutonic Order turned inward, retreating from the open fields of conquest into the hushed corridors of administration, their focus shifting toward governance, economic management, and the preservation of a fragile spiritual and social order. As the medieval world around them began to tilt toward modernity, picture the cold stone walls of their command, the flickering torchlight casting long shadows across intricate tapestries depicting battles long past, the quiet rustle of parchment as decrees and inventories were painstakingly recorded, the scent of candle wax mingling with the faint, metallic tang of armor stored for emergencies, an atmosphere of ritualized diligence and solemn purpose. Some historians argue that this pivot toward administration allowed the order to maintain relevance, transforming their identity from warrior monks into disciplined stewards of land, wealth, and religious tradition, a subtle power rooted in organization rather than brute force. Others suggest that this inward turn was less a choice than a necessity, imposed by military defeats, territorial losses, and the rise of neighboring states whose political and economic ambitions encroached upon the order's former dominions. The Teutonic estates became centers of agriculture, trade, and jurisprudence, managing vast swaths of territory with a meticulous precision that reflected centuries of hierarchical discipline, while simultaneously attempting to integrate local populations whose loyalties were never guaranteed. The Knight brothers, once defined primarily by martial skill, now took on roles as judges, tax collectors, and administrators, their cloistered lives filled with legal disputes, contracts, and the careful maintenance of property records, all carried out under the austere gaze of their Grand Master and the ever-present cross that symbolized divine oversight. Yet, despite this outward calm, the order remained ever aware of the fragile line between authority and irrelevance. Whispers of political intrigue, pressures from emerging European powers, and the unpredictable nature of local uprisings constantly reminded them that survival required adaptation, vigilance, and a careful balancing of spiritual duty with worldly responsibility. This period of quiet transformation also planted the seeds for future resilience, as the order honed skills in diplomacy, negotiation, and institutional continuity that would prove crucial during the turbulent centuries to come. From this vantage point, we see the Teutonic Order not merely as relics of crusading ambition, but as a living organism, learning to bend and flex under historical pressures, preserving identity through meticulous structure, strategic alliances, and a steadfast adherence to ritual and belief, even as the world around them moved inexorably toward revolution, secularization, and the upheavals that would test the very foundations of medieval power. And so, with their swords sheathed but their influence quietly persisting, the order prepared for the next era of transformation, one that would see them confronted not by armies alone, but by ideas that could unravel centuries of tradition, challenging the knights in ways no battlefield ever could. As the 18th century unfolded, the Teutonic Order found itself navigating a Europe increasingly swept by the winds of change, a continent where old certainties were crumbling and the very notion of authority was being questioned. And nowhere was this more evident than in France, where whispers of revolution began to swell into a roar that would shake the foundations of kingdoms, churches, and centuries-old institutions alike. Imagine the quiet commanderies of the order, cloistered and orderly, suddenly juxtaposed against the distant rumble of ideas that rejected aristocracy, hierarchy, and religious privilege. The air was thick not only with candle smoke and parchment dust, but with the subtle tremors of a world on the brink of upheaval. Some scholars suggest that the revolutionary ethos, with its calls for liberty, equality, and fraternity, posed an existential threat to organizations like the Teutonic Order, whose very identity was entwined with the medieval framework of power, land ownership, and Catholic authority, while others note that the order's dispersed presence across Europe allowed it a degree of insulation, a buffer of distance and diplomacy that enabled survival in some regions, even as neighboring powers fell under the revolutionary tide. The military campaigns launched by France under Napoleon Bonaparte further strained the order's resources, compelling them to contribute financially and materially to Habsburg war efforts while simultaneously watching their own manpower diminish, as Knight brothers were drawn away from administration and charity to meet the demands of continental conflict. The toll was cumulative, a slow erosion of the order's capacity to function within its traditional roles, while the once reliable legal protections offered by the Holy Roman Empire began to dissolve, culminating in Napoleon's sweeping administrative reforms that left little room for independent religious orders with autonomous property rights. By the time the decree of suppression arrived in 1809, it was not merely a bureaucratic edict, but the symbolic extinguishing of centuries of accumulated power, knowledge, and influence, as inventories were taken, treasures confiscated, and the last Grand Master, Anton Victor of Austria, prepared to leave the order's historic seat behind forever. Some Knight brothers fled to sympathetic territories. Others assimilated into new political or military structures. Yet all faced a future stripped of institutional support, reliant solely on personal dedication and the fragile networks of correspondence that might preserve memory and tradition. And so, in the autumn chill of 1809, as French officials assumed control and the cross of the Teutonic Order was removed from its stone walls, a centuries-old world quietly faded, leaving only questions of survival, adaptation, and the delicate interplay between faith, power, and history. Questions that would echo for generations in the scattered remnants of an order forced into exile, yet determined to endure. In the wake of suppression, the scattered remnants of the Teutonic Order faced a Europe reshaped by war, revolution, and sweeping administrative reforms. A continent where familiar borders had been redrawn and centuries-old protections no longer existed, leaving individual brothers to navigate uncertainty with a mixture of resilience and quiet desperation. Some seeking refuge in Austrian territories that had remained beyond direct French control, others attempting to preserve their vows while integrating into secular institutions, yet all bound by the memory of an order that had once wielded both temporal and spiritual authority. The survival of their traditions depended less on walls and fortresses than on letters, clandestine meetings, and the painstaking safeguarding of manuscripts, relics, and archives, as if the very act of remembering had become a form of resistance. Anton Victor of Austria, the last Grand Master before suppression, maintained contact with these dispersed members, coordinating efforts from his Austrian refuge. His correspondence, a lifeline in a Europe dominated by Napoleonic administration and the continental system, which reshaped trade, politics, and communication networks, complicating any attempt to restore former stability. Some historians note that these personal networks were crucial, not merely for preservation, but for the eventual possibility of revival, keeping the order's identity alive in the minds and hearts of those who had once worn the black cross on white mantles. Meanwhile, the gradual collapse of Napoleon's empire, accelerated by the disastrous Russian campaign of 1812 and the subsequent coalition victories, reopened the political stage, offering theoretical opportunities for the reassertion of traditional European institutions, though practical realities complicated such restoration, as confiscated properties had been sold, reassigned, or absorbed into new governmental frameworks, leaving the order's revival contingent not only on imperial goodwill but also on diplomacy, negotiation, and the persistence of memory. The Congress of Vienna of 1814 to 1815 attempted to establish principles of restoration, and within this environment, the Austrian Empire emerged as the most promising base for the Teutonic Order's return, as Emperor Francis I, himself a witness to the Order's suppression, possessed both the political authority and conservative disposition to support religious institutions aligned with Habsburg objectives. Yet even with imperial backing, the Order's reconstitution would require redefinition, moving from territorial and military authority to a purely religious and charitable mission, a transformation that demanded patience, adaptation, and a reimagining of centuries-old identity. As the echoes of war faded and the scattered Knight brothers cautiously reconvened, the question lingered: could a medieval order, stripped of its lands and martial power, reinvent itself for a Europe that had changed beyond recognition? Or would the Teutonic legacy be confined to memory, relics, and the faint scent of incense in abandoned halls? By the time Emperor Francis I issued the decree of April 1834, re-establishing the Teutonic Order, Europe had already been transformed by decades of conflict, ideological upheaval, and the slow rise of modern states. And the Order itself emerged not as a sovereign military power, but as a purely religious and charitable institution. Its new mandate carefully defined to emphasize spiritual devotion, service to the poor, and loyalty to the Austrian crown, with explicit prohibition against any resumption of medieval military activities. The choice of Archduke Maximilian of Austria-Este as the first Grand Master of this restored order reflected both political calculation and a commitment to continuity, as he brought military experience from the Napoleonic Wars, deep Catholic convictions, and the prestige necessary to attract aristocratic members willing to invest their time, wealth, and influence in an institution stripped of its territorial authority, yet rich with centuries of ceremonial and spiritual heritage. The headquarters, modestly relocated to the heart of Vienna, symbolized a dramatic shift from rural castles and fortified complexes to an urban environment, a setting more suited to administration, charity, and education than to the command of armies, where the Grand Master and a small cadre of Knight brothers coordinated hospitals, schools, and social services, establishing a visible presence within the metropolitan fabric of the empire, while quietly rebuilding the Order's networks of influence. Recruitment emphasized spiritual and charitable commitment over noble birth, an adaptation that reflected the changing social and political realities of 19th century Europe, where military monasticism had lost its appeal, yet where membership still offered prestige, a sense of purpose, and the opportunity to engage in meaningful service, blending historical identity with practical relevance. The Order's hospitals in Vienna and other cities became centers of modern medical care, applying contemporary techniques while preserving the centuries-old dedication to healing the sick, serving both the wealthy and the indigent, a duality that reinforced the Order's social importance while maintaining its charitable mission. Educational initiatives expanded alongside medical services, as schools combined classical studies with emerging scientific knowledge, always infused with Catholic, moral, and doctrinal instruction, producing generations of students whose professional and personal networks sustained the order's influence throughout the empire. As Europe approached the revolutionary wave of 1848, the Teutonic Order faced scrutiny and criticism, yet its non-political stance and tangible contributions to society allowed it to survive the upheaval, navigating the tension between loyalty to the Habsburg monarchy and the rising calls for liberal and nationalist reform. Still, questions remained about the order's identity. Could it reconcile centuries of military and territorial history with a new role defined solely by charity and faith? Or would the weight of the past forever haunt its efforts to remain relevant in a world increasingly defined by secular governance, social change, and the inexorable march of modernity? As the mid-19th century unfolded, the Teutonic Order found itself navigating a Europe in constant flux, a continent reshaped by industrialization, nationalist movements, and the lingering echoes of Napoleonic upheaval. And yet, within the quiet halls of its Vienna headquarters, a new rhythm of existence began to emerge, one measured not in military campaigns or territorial conquest, but in the steady, deliberate work of charity, education, and spiritual devotion. Hospitals expanded their capacities to accommodate the growing populations of industrial cities, where the poor, sick, and displaced struggled against the relentless pressures of urbanization. And within these wards, knight brothers and lay members applied not only medical skill, but an almost ritualistic discipline, attending to patients with the same devotion that centuries earlier might have been reserved for preparing for battle. A profound transformation that reflected the order's adaptation to the demands of a modernizing society. Educational programs flourished, offering young students a curriculum that balanced classical knowledge with emerging scientific inquiry, yet always framed within the moral and religious instruction that defined Teutonic identity, producing alumni whose influence extended into civil service, academia, and the clerical hierarchy, ensuring that the order's values permeated society even as its traditional territorial power remained absent. Some researchers suggest that these educational and medical networks functioned as a subtle form of influence, a way for the order to remain relevant and respected without violating the political and social boundaries imposed by post-Napoleonic Europe. Meanwhile, the political landscape continued to press upon the order, as revolutionary sentiments and the push for national unification in German-speaking territories created a delicate balancing act. The Teutonic Order's historical origins in Prussia and its centuries of involvement in German affairs invited speculation and scrutiny, yet its integration into Austrian institutional structures demanded loyalty to the Habsburg crown, leaving the organization in a state of quiet tension, neither fully aligned with rising nationalist movements nor entirely detached from them, a liminal position that required discretion, diplomacy, and an unwavering focus on charitable and spiritual work. Even as external pressures mounted, the order cultivated an internal culture of resilience, preserving rituals, ceremonial practices, and networks of correspondence that allowed scattered members to maintain cohesion, institutional memory, and a sense of purpose, fostering a continuity that would prove essential in the decades to come. But as Europe moved inexorably toward the cataclysms of the 20th century, questions lingered about how an institution so deeply rooted in medieval ideals could continue to survive, adapt, and assert relevance in a world increasingly dominated by industrial, secular, and nationalist forces. leaving the future of the Teutonic Order suspended on the delicate edge between history and transformation. The dawn of the 20th century brought with it unprecedented challenges for the Teutonic Order. As the shadows of global conflict loomed over Europe and the delicate balance the order had maintained for nearly a century began to fray. And yet, within its Vienna headquarters, the quiet rhythm of charitable work continued. Hospitals and schools operating as beacons of stability in a continent increasingly unsettled by political tensions, industrialization, and the restless stirrings of nationalism. While the Knight brothers, clad in the symbolic white mantle and black cross, applied their centuries-honed discipline to the practical demands of healthcare, education, and moral guidance, their actions reflecting a remarkable capacity to adapt ancient ideals to the needs of a modernizing society without abandoning the spiritual rigor that had defined the order for centuries. As the First World War erupted in 1914, the Teutonic Order's transformation from a military, monastic entity into a charitable and administrative institution was put to the ultimate test. As hospitals were inundated with casualties, displaced civilians required urgent assistance, and social upheaval stretched resources thin. Yet the order responded with a level of organization and dedication that few contemporary institutions could match. Coordinating medical relief, operating field hospitals, and providing logistical support to military and civilian authorities alike, all while maintaining their ceremonial practices, religious observances, and internal discipline, a dual commitment that required extraordinary resilience from every member. Some historians suggest that the order's centuries of hierarchical organization and procedural rigor enabled it to function effectively under wartime pressures, transforming what had once been a framework for conquest into a network optimized for humanitarian coordination, demonstrating an adaptability that was as practical as it was symbolic. As the Knights navigated the complex demands of modern warfare, while preserving the spiritual and moral principles at the heart of their identity. The collapse of the Austrian Empire in 1918 added yet another layer of uncertainty, as republican governments emerged with skepticism toward aristocratic and religious institutions, scrutinizing property rights, tax exemptions, and the societal influence of organizations like the Teutonic Order. Yet the order's emphasis on demonstrable social value through charitable work allowed it to negotiate a precarious position within the new political framework, preserving core operations while accepting oversight that ensured survival, illustrating a nuanced understanding of the evolving relationship between tradition and modern governance. Even as Europe reeled from the devastation of war, the Teutonic Order's commitment to education, healthcare, and social support provided continuity, a stabilizing force in societies fractured by conflict. Yet questions lingered about how the organization would weather the next storm, as political extremism, economic instability, and rising totalitarianism threatened the very freedoms and protections that allowed it to operate, leaving the future of the centuries-old order suspended between resilience and vulnerability, a delicate tension that would define the decades to come. The interwar years unfolded as a time of cautious expansion and quiet vigilance for the Teutonic Order, a period marked by both opportunity and the persistent shadow of instability, as the fragile democracies of Central Europe struggled under economic depression, social unrest, and political polarization, while the order sought to extend its charitable influence into communities that had been ravaged by war and poverty, establishing soup kitchens, employment assistance programs, and temporary housing initiatives that provided relief for displaced workers, widows, and orphans. their efforts demonstrating not only organizational skill but also a deep understanding of the human need for stability, security, and care, a continuity of purpose that linked the medieval mission of protecting and serving to the pressing social crises of the modern age. And yet, beneath the surface of these seemingly benevolent actions, the order remained acutely aware of the growing dangers posed by political extremism, as nationalist movements, radical ideologies, and authoritarian leaders began to cast a long and foreboding shadow over European society, with some factions openly critical of religious institutions, perceiving them as remnants of an outdated hierarchy incompatible with revolutionary visions of society. Scholars note that during this time, the Teutonic Order had to navigate a delicate balance between visibility and discretion, promoting its charitable work to secure public support and legitimacy while avoiding confrontation with governments increasingly hostile to perceived aristocratic or foreign-influenced organizations, a careful dance that required both prudence and foresight, as any misstep could invite suppression or confiscation of property, undermining decades of careful rebuilding. And yet, in spite of these challenges, the Order expanded its educational programs, founding schools that combined rigorous academic training with moral and religious instruction, ensuring that a new generation of young men and women could inherit the values of the Order, while preparing to navigate an increasingly complex world. And these institutions also served as quiet networks of influence, preserving the Order's legacy, traditions, and esprit de corps in a society that was moving ever further from its medieval roots. As the 1930s advanced, the rise of totalitarian regimes in Germany, Italy, and elsewhere presented an existential threat. And although the Teutonic Order had survived centuries of war, suppression, and political upheaval, the aggressive policies of the Nazis, who viewed religious organizations as potential rivals to their absolute authority, forced the Knights to confront a stark and dangerous reality: continue their charitable work under constant surveillance, risking imprisonment and persecution, or retreat into secrecy and exile, dispersing across neutral countries while striving to maintain the continuity of their spiritual and organizational traditions. A period that would test not only the resilience of the institution, but also the courage and devotion of every individual member, leaving their future suspended in uncertainty. A tension that would explode with the coming of war, as the storm of World War II engulfed Europe. The Teutonic Order found itself in a precarious position, operating under the constant threat of Nazi scrutiny and persecution. Their centuries-old mission of service and charity, now forced into the shadows as they sought to protect both their members and the vulnerable populations they served, with hospitals, orphanages, and educational institutions coming under strict regulation or outright closure. Yet despite these constraints, individual knights displayed remarkable ingenuity and courage, often coordinating covert relief efforts, smuggling supplies to civilians in occupied territories, and providing sanctuary to those targeted by the regime. Their work a quiet defiance against overwhelming oppression, a testament to the Order's enduring commitment to its spiritual and humanitarian principles. And though records are fragmented, accounts from surviving members suggest that these clandestine activities required extraordinary organization, subtlety, and moral resolve, as the very act of charitable service had become a dangerous form of resistance, forcing knights to operate with the precision of a military campaign while navigating the moral ambiguities of survival, collaboration, and protection, all under the omnipresent gaze of a totalitarian state that demanded absolute loyalty and conformity, while simultaneously dismantling or co-opting traditional institutions that could challenge its control. And as the war progressed, the Order's networks extended beyond German-controlled territories, connecting members who had fled to neutral countries, allowing for the preservation of institutional memory, the safeguarding of archives, and the coordination of resources necessary to sustain their mission, however limited it had become. Yet these efforts were never entirely safe, with arrests, imprisonment, and confiscation of property threatening the very fabric of the organization, highlighting the precarious balance between survival and duty, between obedience to faith and navigation of a ruthless political landscape, a reality that cast every decision in shadow, leaving members to weigh immediate risks against the long-term preservation of the Order. And as Allied forces advanced and the Nazi regime began to collapse, the Order faced a new challenge: the reconstruction of their institutions, amidst the physical and social devastation of post-war Europe, a continent scarred by industrialized warfare, mass displacement, and widespread hunger. Their pre-war networks fractured, properties damaged or destroyed, and membership scattered. Yet the resilience cultivated over centuries allowed them to coordinating relief efforts for displaced persons, war widows, and orphaned children, restoring hospitals, schools, and social services, and negotiating with emerging democratic governments for recognition and operational autonomy, all while preserving the ceremonial and spiritual elements that defined their identity. A delicate restoration that would set the stage for the modern incarnation of the Teutonic Order, transforming a once military monastic order into a 20th century institution of charitable, educational, and humanitarian significance, a metamorphosis that would carry its legacy into the contemporary era, raising the question of how an organization with roots in crusading, conquest, could reconcile its medieval identity with the moral imperatives of the modern world. In the wake of the Second World War, the Teutonic Order faced a Europe divided by ideology, with communist regimes in Eastern Europe systematically dismantling religious institutions, seizing properties, and forcing charitable organizations to operate clandestinely or relocate. Yet the Order's leadership, drawing on centuries of experience surviving suppression and exile, redirected their focus toward Western Europe, establishing bases in Austria, Germany, and other neutral regions where they could continue their work in healthcare, education, and social relief, slowly rebuilding both their membership and institutional capacity while navigating a complex political landscape. And in these uncertain times, the Order's historical identity, once defined by crusades, military campaigns, and territorial authority, underwent a profound transformation, emphasizing spiritual devotion, service, and social responsibility over martial prowess, a shift that allowed them to remain relevant in a rapidly modernizing world, while retaining the ceremonial and symbolic elements of their medieval heritage. From the distinctive white mantle and black cross to the hierarchical structures that connected members across generations. And as Europe recovered from war, the Order's hospitals became lifelines for countless displaced individuals, war orphans, and the sick, employing modern medical techniques while honoring the centuries-old commitment to care that had defined their mission since the Middle Ages. Schools reopened and expanded, offering rigorous academic programs infused with moral and religious education, creating networks of alumni who carried the Order's values into public life, while social service initiatives addressed poverty, unemployment, and the needs of vulnerable populations, demonstrating the organization's ability to adapt historical purpose to contemporary social realities. And as the Cold War intensified, the Order's presence in Eastern Europe was increasingly constrained, with members either exiled, operating underground, or integrating their work with state systems in cautious cooperation. Yet these limitations reinforced the Order's resilience, as communication networks, correspondence, and clandestine collaboration preserved institutional memory and tradition, ensuring that the organization's identity survived even in the absence of formal structures. And with the reforms of the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, the Teutonic Order found both challenges and opportunities, embracing social justice, interfaith dialogue, and modernization of practices while maintaining the ceremonial and spiritual continuity that defined their history, integrating lay members alongside clerics, emphasizing professional expertise and charitable dedication, and ultimately creating a structure that balanced historical legacy with contemporary relevance, a delicate equilibrium that allowed the Order to emerge as a modern Catholic institution capable of addressing global humanitarian needs while preserving the aura, ritual, and continuity of a monastic order whose roots stretched back nearly 8 centuries, raising the enduring question of how tradition and modernity can coexist in an organization shaped by both conquest and compassion. By the 1970s, the Teutonic Order had firmly established its modern headquarters in Vienna, a sleek, dignified space that blended historical reverence with contemporary functionality, a place where administrative offices, archives, and ceremonial halls coexisted under one roof, allowing the Order to coordinate its expanding international charitable activities with efficiency and grace. And as visitors passed through its halls, they could almost feel the echoes of centuries past, the quiet weight of monastic discipline and medieval devotion lingering in the air. The Order's modern initiatives now spanned healthcare, education, and social services, addressing contemporary crises with the same disciplined rigor that had once guided knights across frozen Baltic plains. Hospitals offered state-of-the-art medical treatment, while continuing the centuries-old mission of tending the sick and vulnerable. Schools provided rigorous academic curricula infused with moral and religious instruction, and social programs reached refugees, the elderly, and marginalized communities, weaving a network of care that mirrored the Order's historical commitment to service. Yet each modern activity carried the silent imprint of history, from the ceremonial rituals that marked induction of new members to the carefully maintained archives documenting centuries of correspondence, property inventories, and charitable initiatives, ensuring that every act of service remained connected to the Order's enduring identity, and membership evolved to reflect contemporary society, welcoming clerical and lay participants whose professional skills, financial contributions, and personal devotion strengthened the organization's capacity while maintaining the spiritual and ceremonial framework that defined its character. Noble lineage, no longer a prerequisite, but moral integrity, dedication, and a commitment to Catholic principles became the new measure of worth. This shift allowed the Order to attract individuals driven by purpose rather than prestige, yet it also carried a delicate tension, preserving centuries-old tradition while adapting to democratic, modern values. And as the Order's influence spread across Europe and beyond, it became a living testament to resilience, demonstrating how an institution forged in conquest and crusade could transform into a beacon of healing, learning, and humanitarian service. Every hospital, school, and social program a subtle reminder that history is never static, that the mantle of the past can be reinterpreted to meet the demands of the present. And as the night falls over Vienna, and the shadows stretch across the ceremonial halls where white mantles and black crosses hang in quiet repose, one cannot help but wonder, how does an organization that once waged war now define its battles? And how does the echo of medieval steel persist in acts of modern compassion, leaving us to ponder the extraordinary journey from crusader knights to healers, educators, and guardians of human dignity, a transformation that continues to unfold quietly, yet profoundly, across the landscapes of contemporary Europe and the wider world. As the 20th century progressed, the Teutonic Order found itself navigating the turbulent waters of world wars, ideological upheaval, and the rise and fall of empires, each challenge leaving an indelible mark on the organization's structure and identity. During World War I, the orders, hospitals, and medical teams became indispensable to the Austrian war effort, treating tens of thousands of wounded soldiers while simultaneously maintaining services for civilians. Their disciplined approach to logistics, medicine, and pastoral care turned every infirmary into a hub of efficiency and quiet compassion. Yet the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1918 threw the order into a precarious position, as republican governments questioned the relevance and privilege of institutions tied to former monarchies. Properties once tax-exempt or protected faced scrutiny, and the order's continued existence relied not on past glories, but on the tangible social value it provided through charity. During the interwar period, economic depression and political instability created an unprecedented demand for relief, and the Teutonic Order rose to the challenge, opening soup kitchens, organizing employment assistance, and providing temporary housing for displaced workers and refugees. These acts were more than humanitarian efforts. They were a subtle form of survival, demonstrating that the order could remain relevant in a world that had long outgrown the age of knights and crusades. The rise of totalitarian regimes in Europe, however, tested the order's resilience further under Nazi rule. Religious and charitable organizations faced systematic suppression, and the Teutonic Order, with its Germanic heritage and Catholic alignment, was no exception. Members in German-controlled territories risked arrest and imprisonment simply for continuing their charitable work, while others fled to neutral countries, relying on covert networks of communication and trust to maintain a semblance of organizational memory. Yet even in the shadows of oppression, the order's traditions persisted. Private correspondence, hidden archives, and the quiet dedication of individual knights ensured that the centuries-old ethos of service survived. After the end of World War II, the collapse of fascist regimes and the establishment of democratic governments created new opportunities. The Teutonic Order resumed its charitable activities with renewed vigor, addressing the humanitarian crises of the post-war period, caring for war widows, orphaned children, and displaced populations. Their institutional experience allowed them to organize relief efficiently, rebuild infrastructure, and re-establish a sense of stability in a continent scarred by conflict. The late 1940s and early 1950s brought another challenge with the expansion of communist influence across Eastern Europe. Nations like Poland and Czechoslovakia systematically suppressed religious institutions, forcing the order to concentrate its activities in Western Europe and other regions outside the Soviet sphere. Yet through all these disruptions, the core identity of the order endured, adapting quietly to shifting political landscapes. while maintaining the spiritual and charitable principles that had guided it for centuries. And one cannot help but wonder, as we trace this extraordinary resilience, how an organization that once commanded armies could survive the tides of modern ideology, remaining relevant and purposeful in a world that had largely left medieval Europe behind, setting the stage for the transformations that would define its role in the latter half of the 20th century and beyond. The 1960s marked a period of profound transformation for the Teutonic Order as the Second Vatican Council reshaped the landscape of Catholicism, calling for modernization, social justice, and greater engagement with the world beyond strictly ecclesiastical confines. For the Order, this was both a challenge and an opportunity, requiring them to reconcile centuries-old traditions with the demands of a contemporary, rapidly changing society. Leaders embraced reforms that emphasized the Order's charitable mission while ensuring that ceremonial and spiritual practices, which had defined its identity for centuries, were preserved. The focus shifted decisively from historical prestige to practical humanitarian impact, creating programs that addressed poverty, healthcare, and education in ways that were responsive to modern needs. The Order's leadership also saw the importance of establishing a permanent and centralized headquarters, and during the 1970s, a carefully designed facility in Vienna became the epicenter of its revitalized operations. The building was more than administrative space. It was a symbolic bridge between past and present, blending traditional architectural motifs reminiscent of medieval fortresses with modern technology and functional design. Within these walls, clerical and lay members coordinated hospitals, schools, and social programs across Europe, and the Order's approach to membership evolved in response to changing social norms. Noble birth was no longer a prerequisite, replaced by an emphasis on personal commitment, professional skill, and dedication to charitable service. Yet the ceremonial life, the white mantles, the black crosses, and the rituals that tied members to a centuries-old heritage remained intact. This careful balance of adaptation and tradition allowed the Order to flourish as a modern institution while preserving the mystique and spiritual gravity of its medieval past. The Teutonic Order's activities in education expanded significantly during this era, establishing schools that combined rigorous academics with moral and religious instruction. The goal was to shape future generations, not merely as students, but as individuals grounded in ethical principles, capable of contributing meaningfully to society. Simultaneously, healthcare initiatives proliferated, with hospitals and clinics providing advanced medical care in underserved regions, reflecting the Order's enduring commitment to serve the most vulnerable. Social services also extended to refugees, the elderly, and other marginalized populations, creating a network of support that echoed the Order's historical mission of protection and care. Throughout these decades, the Order maintained an unspoken continuity, connecting modern operations to centuries of experience in logistics, organization, and disciplined service. And even as Europe modernized, the Teutonic Order preserved its sense of ritual, hierarchy, and spiritual purpose, ensuring that members remained linked to a living history. Yet, as these transformations solidified, questions lingered about the Order's role in a world vastly different from the one in which it had once been a military and religious powerhouse, setting the stage for its adaptation to the complex humanitarian and educational challenges of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, inviting us to consider how institutions steeped in history can remain alive, relevant, and meaningful in an age defined by rapid change and global interconnection. As the late 20th century unfolded, the Teutonic Order found itself navigating a Europe reshaped by political upheaval, economic transformation, and the lingering shadows of war. The expansion of communist influence across Eastern Europe after World War II had erased much of the Order's presence in regions where it had maintained charitable, educational, and religious activities for over a century. Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other states within the Soviet sphere viewed organizations with ties to Western Europe and the Catholic Church as threats to their ideological control, systematically suppressing their operations, confiscating properties, and imprisoning or exiling members who resisted compliance. Yet even in these harsh conditions, the Order's network of committed individuals found ways to survive, often operating clandestinely or relocating to Western Europe, where democratic governments provided legal protection. The post-war reconstruction period in Austria and neighboring countries offered new opportunities, and the Teutonic Order leveraged its centuries of organizational experience to address widespread humanitarian needs. Hospitals and clinics were reopened or expanded. Educational institutions were revitalized, and social service programs grew to include soup kitchens, housing assistance, and vocational training, all while maintaining a sense of historical continuity and ceremonial gravitas. These efforts not only provided crucial support to populations recovering from the devastation of war, but also reinforced the Order's legitimacy and relevance in a world where aristocratic and religious institutions were increasingly scrutinized. The 1960s and 1970s brought further transformation as the Second Vatican Council's reforms encouraged engagement with modern social issues, interfaith dialogue, and a renewed focus on social justice. The Order responded by integrating these principles into its operations, emphasizing practical charity over symbolic power while preserving its spiritual and ceremonial identity. New administrative headquarters in Vienna became a hub for coordination, training, and governance, blending modern technological efficiency with architectural references to the Order's medieval past. Membership recruitment evolved to prioritize personal commitment, professional expertise, and dedication to charitable work over noble lineage. Yet the ritual, hierarchy, and symbolism of the Order remained intact. The Order's programs reflected an understanding that service, education, and healthcare were interconnected, with hospitals, schools, and social initiatives forming a cohesive network designed to nurture, heal, and educate simultaneously through these decades. The Teutonic Order demonstrated a remarkable capacity for adaptation, maintaining its identity and traditions while responding effectively to contemporary social needs, even as Europe faced the dual pressures of modernization and political fragmentation. The Order's story during this period is a testament to resilience, the careful blending of historical legacy with forward-looking humanitarianism, and the enduring power of institutional memory. Yet, as the Cold War gave way to new geopolitical realities, questions emerged about how an organization rooted in medieval crusading and aristocratic hierarchy could continue to thrive in an increasingly interconnected and secular world, leaving us to wonder how the Teutonic Order would navigate the final decades of the 20th century and step into the challenges of a globalized 21st century. As the 1980s and 1990s progressed, the Teutonic Order confronted a Europe in the midst of profound transformation. The collapse of communist regimes in Eastern Europe opened doors that had been sealed for decades, allowing the Order to cautiously re-establish its presence in regions where its charitable and religious activities had once flourished. Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic became focal points for revival. Yet the landscape they returned to was drastically different from the Europe of their earlier restoration. Centuries of suppression, war, and political upheaval had altered local communities, property ownership, and the social fabric. Some former holdings had been repurposed, while others were still under state control or private ownership. The order had to negotiate, adapt, and often compromise to reclaim even modest footholds. These negotiations were not merely bureaucratic but deeply symbolic, as each regained property represented a tangible connection to a heritage nearly erased. The order's efforts were also met with scrutiny from secular authorities and local populations, some viewing them as relics of a bygone era, while others embraced their charitable contributions and educational initiatives. In response, the order emphasized transparency, practical social impact, and adherence to contemporary legal and ethical standards simultaneously. The order expanded its outreach beyond traditional European strongholds, establishing connections with international Catholic charities, hospitals, and educational networks, leveraging centuries of experience in organization, administration, and social service to contribute meaningfully in regions far from its historical base. This global perspective marked a significant evolution, shifting the Teutonic Order from a regional aristocratic institution to a participant in a worldwide network of humanitarian and religious activity. Internally, the order modernized its governance structures to balance historical ritual and hierarchical identity with contemporary organizational efficiency. Training programs were developed to equip members with skills in medicine, education, and social work, ensuring that ceremonial commitment was matched by practical expertise. The order's archives, manuscripts, and artifacts, once dispersed or hidden during periods of suppression, became central to cultural and scholarly projects, museum exhibitions, historical research, and educational initiatives reinforced the order's historical significance, while providing public access to centuries of accumulated knowledge. In this era, the Teutonic Order became a living bridge between the medieval world and the modern age, a symbol of continuity and adaptation. Yet even as they thrived in some areas, questions lingered about their relevance in a society increasingly secular, diverse, and globalized, inviting reflection on how a centuries-old institution could preserve its identity while meeting the evolving needs of the world, leaving us to wonder what paths the Teutonic Order would take as it stepped fully into the 21st century, balancing tradition, faith, and service in a rapidly changing world. Entering the dawn of the 21st century, the Teutonic Order faced a world both familiar and unrecognizable. Centuries of survival had honed an instinct for adaptation, yet globalization, technological advancement, and shifting social values presented challenges that no knightly training could have foreseen. The Order's modern headquarters in Vienna became a hub not only for administration but for innovation in charitable outreach, equipped with communication systems that connected members across continents. Digital archives preserve centuries of history while enabling scholars worldwide to access the Order's rich documentation. Hospitals and clinics operated with state-of-the-art medical practices, blending the Order's centuries-old commitment to care with modern scientific rigor. Schools under their patronage embraced contemporary curricula, incorporating technology, foreign languages, and secular subjects alongside moral and religious instruction. These institutions were no longer simply local centers of influence, but nodes in a network that spanned Europe and extended into other continents. The Order's social programs expanded to address contemporary crises, from refugee assistance and disaster relief to combating modern poverty and healthcare inequities. Every initiative reinforced the Order's enduring principle: service as a spiritual and social mission rather than a pursuit of power or prestige. Membership evolved as well, drawing not only from aristocratic families but from professionals, academics, and volunteers dedicated to Catholic values and humanitarian work. Rigorous training ensured that each member could contribute meaningfully while participating in ceremonial and spiritual life that anchored them to centuries of tradition. The symbolic mantle and cross now carried layered meanings, representing resilience, historical continuity, and commitment to the vulnerable, rather than military conquest. In parallel, the Order engaged with historical scholarship and public education. Museums, exhibitions, and academic conferences illuminated the complex legacy of the Teutonic Order, exploring its medieval military campaigns, colonial endeavors, and cultural impact. These narratives were presented with nuance, acknowledging both contributions and controversies, inviting reflection rather than blind admiration. International collaborations reinforced the Order's presence in global Catholic networks, partnering with NGOs, religious institutions, and educational bodies to amplify their impact. Yet despite this outward expansion, the Order maintained the quiet rhythms of internal ritual, spiritual reflection, and mutual support among members, a continuity of identity that linked 21st century members with those who had fled Mergentheim centuries earlier, navigating exile, suppression, and restoration in this era. The Teutonic Order exemplifies the tension between history and modernity, ritual and innovation, tradition and service, leaving us to ponder how an institution forged in the fires of medieval crusades could transform into a global humanitarian presence, and what mysteries of resilience, adaptation, and purpose continue to guide these descendants of knights as they carry forward a legacy nearly a millennium old. As the 21st century unfolded, the Teutonic Order's work extended beyond Europe, reflecting both the demands of a connected world and the enduring human need for organized compassion. Hospitals supported by the Order provided medical care in underserved regions of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, blending mobile clinics with local partnerships to reach populations isolated by geography, conflict, or poverty. Schools sponsored by the Order offered scholarships and educational programs that emphasized not only academic excellence but moral responsibility, teaching students to engage with complex ethical questions while fostering empathy and community awareness. Social programs addressed pressing humanitarian crises, from disaster relief after earthquakes and floods to refugee resettlement and support for victims of war and displacement. These efforts were carefully coordinated through modern, logistical systems that reflected the Order's centuries-old experience in administration and organization. Digital communication platforms allowed members spread across continents to maintain cohesion, exchange knowledge, and coordinate charitable initiatives with precision. Yet beneath these technological achievements remained the Order's core identity, a spiritual and ceremonial life that linked members to a lineage dating back to the 12th century. Daily rituals, communal prayers, and ceremonial events served as touchstones of continuity, reminding members of the centuries of resilience, exile, and restoration that had defined their predecessors. Historical consciousness was central to the Order's contemporary identity. Archives containing manuscripts, records, and artifacts were meticulously preserved, not as relics of power, but as living tools for education, reflection, and scholarship. Exhibitions and public programs invited communities to engage with the complexities of medieval crusading, European expansion, and religious history, encouraging nuanced understanding rather than simplistic heroism. International collaborations positioned the order within networks of humanitarian and religious organizations, allowing them to contribute expertise, resources, and credibility to global initiatives while maintaining independence and fidelity to their traditions. Recruitment and membership policies emphasized commitment, competence, and moral integrity over social status, creating a diverse, skilled, and dedicated body capable of sustaining the Order's mission. Yet even amid global operations, the Order retained a sense of intimacy and personal responsibility. Small teams oversaw local projects, ensuring that the human connection, the touch of care, the guidance of education, the comfort of support remained tangible, visible, and profound. The symbolism of the white mantle and black cross now carried layered meanings, representing a history of survival, adaptation, and moral purpose. A quiet but powerful testament to the transformation from medieval crusading knights to modern agents of humanitarian care. And as the Order continues to navigate an unpredictable world, the question lingers: how do institutions with roots in conquest and feudal hierarchy reconcile with the needs, values, and ethics of a global, interconnected humanity? And what lessons might we draw from their centuries-long journey of resilience, adaptation, and service? As we step into the contemporary era, the Teutonic Order stands as a quiet yet formidable presence, its activities spanning Europe and reaching into parts of the world far from its medieval origins. The Order's charitable missions operate with precision and purpose, addressing modern crises with the same meticulous organization that once orchestrated campaigns across the Baltic and Prussian lands. Hospitals continue to form the heart of their operations, equipped with advanced medical technology, yet guided by an ethos cultivated over centuries. Patients sense the weight of history in the calm efficiency and unwavering dedication of staff who carry forward a legacy of service. Forged in battlefields and cloisters alike, educational initiatives reflect a careful balance between tradition and innovation. Schools and training programs integrate classical studies with contemporary scientific, technological, and ethical instruction, nurturing minds capable of leadership, compassion, and civic responsibility. Social outreach programs tackle systemic inequality, homelessness, and the needs of displaced populations, echoing the medieval Order's commitment to addressing suffering within their communities. Volunteers and professionals alike bring specialized skills to these initiatives, yet every action remains infused with the symbolic weight of the Order's past. Ceremonial life, though no longer tied to conquest or territorial control, continues to anchor members in a shared identity. The white mantle and black cross now represent continuity, resilience, and moral dedication. Rituals, prayers, and commemorations connect modern members to the countless predecessors who faced exile, suppression, and the challenge of redefining purpose. Archival work ensures that history informs the present. Manuscripts, letters, and artifacts are preserved not merely as records but as guides, offering insight into governance, charity, and adaptability. These archives support research, education, and cultural understanding, demonstrating the Order's commitment to intellectual as well as humanitarian pursuits. International collaboration allows the order to respond to crises with both local sensitivity and global coordination. Lessons learned from centuries of adaptation inform responses to disasters, public health emergencies, and educational needs. Yet despite this extensive network, the Teutonic Order retains an intimacy in its operations. Small teams and local initiatives ensure that aid is personal, immediate, and transformative. The story of the Order illustrates the remarkable capacity of an institution to survive, to evolve, and to transform adversity into enduring purpose. From medieval knights bound by oaths of military and religious duty to modern practitioners of charity, education, and healthcare, the Order embodies a continuity that is both inspiring and mysterious, leaving us to ponder: how does a centuries-old institution reconcile the weight of history with the demands of the present? And as we sit back, reflect, and listen, one can't help but feel the subtle hum of history itself whispering through these modern halls, reminding us that the past is never truly gone, but lives on in the work, devotion, and identity of those who carry it forward, quietly shaping the world in ways both seen and unseen. And now, we arrive at the present-day incarnation of the Teutonic Order, a remarkable institution that has not only survived the upheavals of centuries, but has transformed itself into a beacon of enduring purpose, its identity no longer forged in the heat of battlefields or bound by the exigencies of medieval politics. Yet the echoes of its past reverberate through every act, every ritual, and every decision. Today's order operates primarily as a humanitarian and educational organization, reaching across borders to provide medical care, social services, and academic opportunities to those most in need. Hospitals once established centuries ago have evolved into centers of modern medicine, combining cutting-edge technology with a deep-rooted philosophy of compassionate care. Patients in these wards may not fully grasp that the calm efficiency and organized structure guiding their treatment are the legacy of an order whose earliest members navigated war, famine, and exile with discipline and foresight. Education remains a cornerstone of contemporary activity. Schools and scholarship programs cultivate knowledge, ethical reflection, and leadership, teaching students to navigate the modern world with integrity and skill, while instilling an appreciation for history and tradition. Social programs address systemic inequities, refugee crises, and support for marginalized communities, translating the medieval ethos of service into practical, tangible impact in the 21st century. The Order's ceremonial and spiritual practices maintain a link to centuries of ritual. The white mantle and black cross, now emblematic of healing, learning, and service rather than conquest. Yet these symbols carry a weight, a reminder of resilience through suppression, war, and political transformation. Membership has expanded beyond aristocratic lines to include clerical and lay participants drawn by commitment, skill, and a shared dedication to Catholic principles, creating a network of individuals whose collective effort extends far beyond any single region. International coordination allows the Order to respond swiftly to humanitarian crises, leveraging centuries of accumulated organizational knowledge to address complex problems with both efficiency and moral clarity. Historical preservation remains central, with archives and artifacts meticulously maintained to inform research, cultural understanding, and public education, allowing the lessons of the past to guide the present. The Teutonic Order's journey from medieval crusading knights to a modern, humanitarian institution underscores the extraordinary adaptability of human organizations, the ability to survive, transform, and maintain identity through shifting political, social, and religious landscapes. As we reflect on nearly 8 centuries of continuous existence, we are left with a haunting, almost cinematic truth that history is not merely recorded in books or artifacts, but lives on in the actions, commitments, and evolution of those who inherit it. And perhaps the greatest mystery of all is how an institution born of war and conquest has endured to become a quiet force for healing, education, and compassion, a living bridge between the tumultuous past and the uncertain, ever-changing present, leaving us to wonder what the centuries ahead will hold for this remarkable order, and how its enduring spirit will continue to shape the world in subtle, profound ways that history itself may only fully reveal in time.